the goods and services market and the money market together in one place. So the question is, how are they linked? First, let's start with the goods and services market. You remember the language, you remember the concepts, you remember the labels. On the y-axis, aggregate expenditures. On the x-axis, GDP. 45-degree helpline. Along this 45-degree helpline, aggregate expenditures are equal to national income. We start from autonomous aggregate expenditures 1, and this is aggregate expenditure curve 1. Equilibrium, which means this level of national income and this level of aggregate expenditures. All right, now on this side we have the money market. Okay, I'm making it smaller, but it does not mean that it's less important. On the y-axis, the interest rate. On the x-axis, real balances. Here we have the money supply, M over P. M is the nominal money supply. That is in direct hands of a central bank, primarily using the either open market operations or or the discount rate. P is the general price level, which for the time being we are keeping constant or predetermined. All right, so P is constant. So together MP is the real money supply. Okay, and this negatively sloped line or curve is the money demand curve. All right, okay, so this is equilibrium in the money market. This is the equilibrium interest rate, and this is the equilibrium level of real balances. Okay, now in red, this red here. Okay, let's assume that there is an increase. Let's assume that there's an increase in autonomous government spending. All right, so where does the event start? Does it start in the goods and services market, or does it start in the money market? The event starts in the goods and services market because G is part of aggregate expenditures. All right, so what's going to happen in the goods and services market? The increase in autonomous government spending will increase autonomous aggregate expenditures, and that in turn will increase aggregate expenditures, and that in turn will increase GDP. All right? So this analysis up to now is self-contained in the goods and services market. It has not yet traversed into the money market. All right? Now, graphically, how do we show this event here, this increase in government spending? Well, question is it a parallel or a non-parallel shift of the aggregate expenditure curve? The answer is it's a parallel shift of the aggregate expenditure curve because we're dealing with a change in an autonomous factor. So where we'll get a new origin, so this will be marked as, labeled as aggregate expenditures 2, more precisely autonomous aggregate expenditures 2, and it's going to be a parallel shift of the aggregate expenditure curve because the denominator of the model equation has not changed. MPC has not changed. T has not changed. Neither has MPI. In other words, the slope of the aggregate expenditure curve has not changed. So we get a new aggregate expenditure curve, which we label as aggregate expenditure curve 2. We get a new equilibrium, there it is, E2, a new level of aggregate expenditures, and a new level of GDP, or Y in this case. All right? All right. So as you see, the graphical portion of this analysis verifies what we said here below, that an increase in autonomous G will increase autonomous aggregate expenditures. You notice they went from autonomous AE1 to autonomous autonomous AE2, right there, yeah? And aggregate expenditures also went up from AE1 to AE2. And as you see, GDP also went up from Y1 to Y2. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the money market. All right. So in a money market, what's going to happen? Well, in a money market, which color? I guess I'm going to use red here. Yeah. So in the money market, it started in the goods and services market, and will now enter the money market. All right. Now, question: this increase in GDP, which is due to an increase in government spending, is it a supply event or is it a demand event? Well, it's a demand event. Because remember, what makes up money demand, or L? Well, what determines money demand? Demand for money, for liquidity by consumers, firms, the government, and foreigners. And by foreigners, we mean foreign consumers, foreign firms, foreign governments. Well, an increase in government spending is indeed or it indeed causes an increase in money demand. So money demand will increase because now the government is in competition with the other actors for the liquidity. So that increases money demand. So money demand would move rightward. It's a rightward shift of L1 to L2. It's a shift. There it is. So what changes? Well, what changes is what the hell? So the change is an increase in the interest rate. All right? An increase in the interest rate. And what has happened to money supply? Nothing. Well, up to now, nothing, right? This is short term. We're looking at the short term fluctuations of the economy. So in green here, let's continue. All right. So we left off our goods and services market analysis with an increase in Y. So when this enters the money market, what happens is money demand, L, increases, and in turn this increases the interest rate. All right? And obviously, for our purposes at this time, we stop with this. However, you must realize that this increase in the interest rate will eventually what? Turn around and in turn affect the goods and services market. Except at this point, I want to stop with an increase in the interest rate. Okay, let's continue with another event. Okay, a second example. Goods and services market. Aggregate expenditures, GDP, 45-degree help line. Along this 45-degree help line, aggregate expenditures are equal to GDP. Autonomous aggregate expenditures 1. Aggregate expenditure curve 1. This is the equilibrium. This is the equilibrium level of aggregate expenditures. And this is the equilibrium level of GDP. And now in the money market. All right. So in the money market, interest rate, real balances, money supply, M over P, M being the nominal money supply, that is in direct control of the central bank. P, that's the general price level, that is not in the pockets of the central bank. And for the time being, we're assuming that P, the general price level, is predetermined or constant. M over P together are referred to as the real money supply. And this negatively sloped line or curve is the money demand curve. let's call it L1. Let's call this M1, and let's just assume that P is constant. So we'll put a P1 there. All right. So we have equilibrium interest rate, and equilibrium level of real balances. And now in red, I introduce an event, and the event is expansionary monetary policy. So where will the event start? The event will start in the money market, and it will eventually move into the goods and services market. So, expansionary monetary policy will do what? It will shift the real money supply curve rightward. So we would have M2 over P1. And what will that do? Well, that will move the equilibrium to E2, and that would lower the interest rate and increase the real balances, increase the liquidity in the economy. So an increase in M, the nominal money supply, will increase the real money supply. And that in turn will push the interest rates down. And well, that's the finality of the event in the money market. But again, what happens in the money market will eventually transmit itself into the goods and services market. So what's going to happen in the goods and services market? This lowering of the interest rate is going to increase the physical investments. All right. Now, let's assume that there's a link between the interest rate and physical investments. All right. And the standard textbook example would tell us that whenever interest rates fall, physical investments increase. So what would we expect to happen? We would expect aggregate expenditures to go up, and in turn we would expect GDP to go up. All right? So how would we show this graphically in the goods and services market? Well, we would show it we would show it like this. So this would be a new aggregate expenditure curve. Let's call this AE curve 2. All right. So this would be a new level of aggregate of autonomous aggregate expenditures. This would be a new equilibrium. This would be a new level of aggregate expenditures, and this would be the new level of GDP. All right. Okay. So that's how we would show the linkages between the two markets. Just remember that whatever starts in the goods and services market will eventually spread into the money market, and whatever starts in the money market will eventually spread into the other market. All right, the two markets are interrelated. Now, I've chosen to stop here with this increase in GDP, but you should understand that business cycles go on, right? I mean, in the long term, this increase in GDP will eventually reverberate back into the money market, right? How? Well, in the long term, it would definitely increase money demand. And that in turn would, well, but we have to stop somewhere. So at this point, I'm just saying that we're dealing with short-term fluctuations. Okay, third and last example, yeah? Again, let me choose a color, black. So here, goods and services market. Aggregate expenditures, GDP. Again, 45-degree help line. Aggregate expenditures are equal to GDP. Autonomous aggregate expenditures 1. Shaped like this. Let's label this as aggregate expenditure curve 1. Initial equilibrium. Initial level of aggregate expenditures 1. Initial level of GDP Y1. And here we have the money market. All right, so interest rate, real balances, M, nominal money supply, P, general price level. Let's call this M1, let's call this P1. Together M1 over P1, that's the real money supply. All right? And of course, money demand, L1. Equilibrium or initial equilibrium, equilibrium interest rate, equilibrium level of real balances, and now let me choose an event. The event being an increase in the personal income tax rate. Okay, so question, this event, will it start in the goods and services market or will it start in the money market? It'll start in the goods and services market because the personal income tax rate is part of aggregate expenditures. So what's going to happen? Well, if there's an increase in the personal income tax rate, disposable income will go down. And in turn, consumption will go down. And in turn, aggregate expenditures will go down. And in turn, national income will go down. All right? All right, so this part of the transmission process that's contained in a goods and services market. Now let's see how this would change graphically, the goods and services market. Would it be a parallel or a non-parallel shift of the AE curve? It would be a non-parallel shift because autonomous aggregate expenditures would not change. T, you remember, is part of the denominator. So whenever MPC or T or MPI changes, that will affect the slope of the aggregate expenditure curve. T increases, so the slope will change. All right, so it's a non-parallel shift down, isn't it? Down. So this would be the new aggregate expenditure curve 2 with a new equilibrium, which means that aggregate expenditures 2 go down. What else decreases? So this is now Y2. GDP decreases. All right. So as this graph shows, AE decreased from E1 to E2, and GDP decreased from Y1 to Y2. Now, what starts in one market will eventually be transferred over to the other market. So now, let's use this psychedelic color. All right, we go in this direction. So, a decrease in GDP. Will this cause a change in the money supply or a change in money demand? Well, L1 or L, money demand. You remember the equation, right? L is equal to KY minus HI. So Y is part of the money demand function, and it's positively linked to money demand, right? So if Y decreases, money demand will also decrease. And it stands to reason, right? I mean, if consumption goes down because of a higher personal income tax rate, then it stands to reason that consumers will not need as much money to run their consumption transactions with. So money demand will go down. So all of that said, let me switch to red. All of that said, money demand will fall. It's a leftward shift of the money demand curve from L1 to L2. So we have a new equilibrium, E2, and a lower interest rate. Right? Money, remember, money supply has not changed. Right? Okay, so well, let me continue this. So this decrease in GDP would lower money demand, and in turn that would lower the interest rate. Now for our purposes we stop right here, this decrease in the interest rate. But you know, in economy it never stops. So if we were to continue this, if interest rates fall, this would obviously spread into the goods and services market. It would come right back. Well, if interest rates fall, would there be a change in one of the components of aggregate expenditures? Of course. The primary one would be physical investments. All right, but we're not there yet, so I stop with this decrease in the interest rate. Okay, so examples 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so eventually what we're going to do is we're going to take the goods and services market and the money market, and well, we'll draw out of the two markets an analysis model which we call ISLM analysis. Right? So here I'm not going to fully explain the ISLM model. What I want to do is just to introduce it in very general terms. All right, let me switch colors. So here we have the goods and services market, which looks like this. And here we have the money market, which looks like this. Yeah. Okay. And here in the middle somewhere, we will have the ISLM model. So, in the ISLM model, we have the interest rate on the y-axis, and we have y, or GDP, on the x-axis. This is the IS curve. Now, what is the IS curve? The IS curve is a summary of the goods and services market. All right, back to red, and this is the LM curve. And what is the LM curve? The LM curve is a summary of the money market. All right, just for your information, IS, well, what do they stand for, IS? I, capital I, stands for investments. S represents savings. You remember the equation from the savings portion of the course, where SB, private savings, plus SG, savings of the government, plus SR, savings of the foreigners, is equal to I, physical investments. All of this, SP plus SG plus SR, being equal to total savings. So what is S? S is total savings. SP plus SG plus SR. And what is I? Physical investments. Turning your attention to the LM curve, the designation L. What does that stand for? L, in the money market, represents money demand. What does M stand for in the money market? It stands for the nominal money supply. All right? So this is how I am introducing the ISLM model. All right? Eventually we will develop it further, not only graphically. I'm going to re-explain all of this once again, so don't worry. So I will not only cover it graphically, I will also do it, we'll also do it mathematically. All right? So we'll come back to this analysis. The ISLM model is, it has its flaws, it has its problems, but in macroeconomics, the ISLM model is probably considered the most useful tool of macroeconomic analysis. Probably. All right? Okay. So let me end it here. Thank you.